Hello and welcome. Please take a seat, get cozy and enjoy another Halloween edition of A Cup of Terror with me, Stefanie Valentine. Hello my spooky little pumpkins. Thank you for coming back to join me once more. If this is your first time here, welcome. Thank you for being here. A Cup of Terror is a series of videos where I talk about true crime cases that have a dash of the strange, be that supernatural or to do with the occult or just something downright odd. So this is Halloween video number 2. I've got my favourite pumpkin with me. Now there is a content warning for this one, as the case unfortunately involves children and the murder of a child. I don't talk about anything too graphic, but if this is not something you want to listen to, then please click off this video and I hope to see you on one of my other ones. It is highly likely that you will have come across some of the ripple effects that have happened because of this case. You know how every year on social media, in the papers, there's always stories, people worried about how there's someone in the community going around messing with Halloween sweets and chocolates that are given out to children when they're trick-or-treating. You know, the razor blades hidden in the chocolate and the sweets that have had something dodgy put in them. Thankfully for the large majority of the time, the stories are just worries and fear and nothing comes of it. But unfortunately, for one particular family, the horror became all too real. Ronald O'Brien lived in Deer Park, Texas, with his wife, Diane, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth. We don't really know anything about Ronald's early life, other than the fact that he was born on the 19th of October 1944. He worked as an optician at Texas State Optical in Sharpstown, Houston. He was a deacon for the Second Baptist Church and also sang in their choir. He also ran the local bus program. He was well liked and respected in his community and people really looked up to him. But what they didn't know was that there was a dark side to this seemingly upstanding man. On the night of Halloween 1974, the O'Brien family went for dinner at the Bates' family home in Pasadena, Texas, which is not too far from Deer Park where they lived. Afterwards, the children of both families had planned to go trick-or-treating together in Pasadena. Ronald and Jim Bates took the O'Brien children and Bates's young son out for the evening. They were doing well, getting a lot of sweets and having a grand old time. When the group arrived at one particular home, the lights were out and it didn't look like anyone was in. The kids went and knocked on the door anyway, just in case someone was home and they could get even more sweets. There was no answer. The kids grew impatient and they went on to the next house and Jim went with them. Ronald stayed behind for another 30 seconds or so, as if he was waiting a little bit longer to see if the occupants of the house would answer. He soon caught up to the rest of the group, triumphantly holding 5 giant 21-inch Pixy sticks, claiming that the people had finally answered. For those of you who aren't American and don't know what Pixy sticks are, they're basically a sugary powder, I think like sherbet over here, and they're in these like straw things and you pour them into your mouth. He gave 1 each to the 3 children in the group. He gave Jim Bates another one to give to his other child who was at home, and he gave the last one to 10-year-old Whitney Parker, who he recognised from church. The group went their separate ways, with Ronald taking his 2 children back home. Before bed, the children were allowed to have one treat from their Halloween haul. Ronald urged Timothy to try the Pixy stick. The boy had trouble getting the sugar out of the tube, so Ronald helped to loosen it so he could eat it. The boy complained that it tasted bitter, so Ronald gave him some Kool-Aid to wash it down. Timothy immediately became ill and he ran to the bathroom, where he started vomiting uncontrollably and he started convulsing as well. Ronald called for an ambulance and he claimed that he held his son, but he went limp in his arms. On the way to the hospital, and less than an hour after he'd eaten the candy, 8-year-old Timothy O'Brien was dead. Timothy's death from consuming some of the Halloween candy obviously terrified and outraged a lot of parents, and a ripple of fear ran through the community. Many of them handed in the sweets that their children had collected from trick-or-treating. They were worried that that was also poisoned. Initially, Ronald wasn't a suspect until Timothy's autopsy. It was revealed that the Pixy stick had been laced with a fatal dose of potassium cyanide. Thankfully, the police managed to recover the 4 other Pixy sticks before they were eaten. Remember I mentioned the other boy, Whitney Parker, who had been given one of these sticks. His parents were hysterical because they couldn't find it. They were so worried and upset, and they ran into his room, and thankfully they found him asleep with it in his hand. He hadn't been able to open it, and that had saved Whitney's life that night. He hadn't been strong enough to open the staples. Can you imagine the relief his parents felt when they realised that their child was okay? According to a pathologist who tested the sweets, the one that Timothy had consumed contained enough cyanide to kill 2 adults, while the 4 other sweets contained enough to kill 3 to 4 adults. Poor Timothy went through a horrific ordeal, but can you imagine how much more pain he would have gone through if he'd eaten one of the other sticks? It didn't take long for police to really suspect Ronald. They took him back to the neighbourhood the group had been trick-or-treating in, so that he could show them the house that he claimed gave the sticks to him. He couldn't remember. He just couldn't figure out which house it was. But they'd only been trick-or-treating on 2 streets and only visited a few homes before it started raining and they had to stop. When police visited these homes, none of them had handed out Pixy sticks that night. So the police are thinking that this is kind of suspicious. Eventually, Ronald finally remembered which house it was, and he led them to this house, the one that where no one had answered. He claimed that he didn't see the face of the person that handed him the sweets. He only saw his arm, which he described as hairy. So this guy apparently just stuck his arm out of the door and shoved the sweets at Ronald. The house was owned by Courtney Melvin. Courtney was an air traffic controller who worked at William Hobby P. Airport in Houston. He wasn't home, so the police went to his workplace and they arrested him in front of his colleagues. The only thing was Courtney had a rock-solid alibi. He was working that night and he didn't get home till around 11 p.m. His wife and daughter were at home, but they turned the light out early as they'd run out of sweets. Courtney had nearly 200 people corroborate his alibi, so it definitely wasn't him. The police looked further into Ronald O'Brien and his life. They discovered that he had crippling money issues. He was over $100,000, equivalent to about $500,000, $500,000 in today's money. He was in that much debt. His car was being repossessed. He had defaulted on several bank loans. He was suspected of theft at his job at the opticians, and the company wanted to fire him. And that wasn't the first time a company wanted to get rid of him. Ronald had been employed by 21 different companies over a 10-year period, and he had been fired from every one of them. So he was not a good employee. Now, detectives learned that Ronald had been telling colleagues about how his financial situation would improve very soon. So what made Ronald think that his money woes would soon disappear? Well, in January 1974, that same year, Ronald had taken out $10,000, over $50,000 in today's money, life insurance policies on both of his children. And then 1 month before Timothy's death, he had taken out a further $20,000 policy on each child. The various policies totaled to approximately $60,000. And to just really hammer home the suspicion, Ronald called the insurance company the next morning. Literally, like a few hours after his son had died, he's on the phone to the insurance company, inquiring about how he can collect the policies. I mean, he wasn't really trying that hard to look innocent. Like, mate, leave it a few days at least. Like, make it look like you're upset about your son dying. Police spoke to a couple of people who had had strange interactions with him. A chemist who was acquainted with Ronald told of how he had been contacted and asked about cyanide and how much would be required to be fatal. Another particular man was one of Ronald's customers, and he was a chemical salesman. He told police that Ronald had been very interested in poisons, and in particular potassium cyanide, and he asked where he could purchase some. Ronald had also visited a chemical supply store in Houston shortly before Halloween that year, looking to buy some cyanide. He left soon after though, because it was kind of a wholesale place, and he was told that the smallest amount that he could purchase was £5. By the way, it was I was interested to see what potassium cyanide was used for, and apparently it can be used for quite a lot of things, like extracting gold and silver from like ores, and used for electroplating, used in printing. So it has a lot of different uses. Yeah, you learn something new every day. So it's not looking good for Ronald. During a search of his home, police found candy residue on a pocket knife and also traces of plastic. Police believed that he was planning on killing both of his children, collecting on both their life insurance policies, and then he gave the extra poisoned Pixy sticks to other children to deflect suspicion away from himself and to cover up the crime. It didn't work though, and on the 5th of November 1974, Ronald was arrested for his son Timothy's murder. He was charged with 1 count of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. Now, this is the 70s. Investigators don't have access to the technology and the resources that we have today, and they couldn't definitively prove that Ronald had bought the cyanide or where he had bought it, and they couldn't even prove that he was the one to lace the Halloween sweets. Ronald, who was nicknamed the Candy Man and also the man who killed Halloween, he maintained his innocence. His trial began on the 5th of May 1975 in Houston. He entered a not guilty plea to all 5 counts, and his defense was to blame some other sick individual using Halloween as a cover to go around poisoning children. But his family, friends and co-workers all testified against him. His friends and co-workers testified that in the months leading up to Timothy's death, he had taken a particular interest in cyanide, and he would keep talking about how much it would take to kill a person. Ronald's sister-in-law and brother-in-law testified that on the day of Timothy's funeral, Ronald talked about using the insurance policy money to take a nice long holiday and buy some nice things. A little bit obvious, isn't it? On the 5th of June 1975, it took just 46 minutes for the jury to find Ronald guilty of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. And 71 minutes later, they sentenced him to death by electrocution. His legal team, they kept trying to appeal the verdict for years, nearly a decade in fact. He had 3 execution dates delayed. So it wasn't until the 31st of March 1984, just after midnight, that he was finally put to death for his crime. By that point, the electric chair was no longer used, so his life was ended with a lethal injection. And apparently he was the first person in Texas to receive death by lethal injection after they stopped using the electric chair. Outside the Texas State Penitentiary, there was a crowd of around 300 people waiting to hear of the moment when the Halloween poisoner had died. Ronald's wife filed for divorce soon after he was convicted, and she later remarried, and her new husband adopted Elizabeth, her daughter. Ronald's actions would forever impact trick-or-treating. Like even now, like every year, there's always stories going around of fears that Halloween sweets have been tampered with, and to be extra vigilant, you know, check through it all before your children start eating any of it. When I was younger, I obviously heard all of these stories, but I just thought it was an urban legend, you know, something to scare us. And it wasn't until I heard about this case that I realized that a lot of it is down to this horrible man and his reprehensible actions. Like, oh, it makes me shudder. Like, thinking of this man knowingly attempting and achieving with one of them to kill his own children, and then to use other children as collateral damage. Like, he just didn't care. Oh, horrible. Ooh. Ooh. Anyway, that is today's video. Truly an evil person. Thank you for hanging out with me today, and if you enjoyed this Halloween video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and join me next time for the last, at least for this year, Halloween edition of A Cup of Terror.